Welcome to the second of, I believe, 9 office hours. I will turn it over to Mike Bauer, CLI Squad Lead.
To get us started though and get some ideas flowing, I did put together an agenda for today. If you have any questions along the way on anything specific that I'm covering, or even something I'm not covering that you find urgent and would like to ask a question, feel free to just interrupt me and ask away. The agenda I put together today will kick off with talking about the Zowe releases, the scheduling, and the technology expectations from all of you extending our technologies. We'll then jump into the key new features of Zowe CLI. These include team configuration, automatic team configuration, Daemon mode, which provides improved performance, and that the secure credential store, which was previously a plugin, is now a default feature in the core Zowe CLI. I did cover these in the introductory session that Rose mentioned that was hosted in early December. However, these will be a little bit more detailed this time. I'll then jump into breaking changes in V2 conformance. This is much of what was covered in that session, but I'll try to slow it down and feel free to ask any detailed questions during those sections. Show some resources you can use to get started. And then we'll continue with some additional Q&A at the end if you have any more questions. So now I'll jump into a few new key features of Zowe CLI. The first is team configuration, which is aimed to significantly improve the onboarding experience and provides the ability to easily share configuration with others in an organization. So what we've seen in Zowe V1 LTS is a few folks within organizations, they'll get up and running with CLI profiles. And then two things happen. One is that as they adopt more and more plugins, they have to create more and more profiles, which becomes one, difficult to manage, but two, difficult to share with others in their organization. They may have to write custom automation for other folks to run to get set up, or have long instruction sheets telling people what commands to run in order to get set up and ready to start running commands. This paradigm has now shifted so that most users don't need to manage config directly. And what I mean by that is I have this separated into two different personas. One is an administrator and one is a user. Of course, if you're the first one at a site, you're the user and the administrator if you're trying out the software. But the administrator will issue a Zowe config init command. This will generate a template Zowe config JSON and Zowe schema JSON file. The Zowe config JSON is now the single file where you'll manage all of the configuration for your particular environment. And then once it's created and verified, the administrator can host this in a shared location, and then users within that organization can simply import that config to their local environment and start running commands. No need to run any separate profiles command. They can simply get started using the tool for their particular use case. Now, there are a couple advanced options for further customization. Users, if they want to, can override the config settings that were shared to them by an administrator by constructing a Zowe config user JSON file. This is more of an advanced use case, requires a little bit more knowledge, and they'd have to have some knowledge of the configuration, but they could do that if they wanted to have their own custom settings. And then another advanced feature, which I personally make a lot of use of, is that teams and users can store config within a project instead of globally in their environment. Where I find this really useful is I'm working on a lot of different continuous integration projects, and maybe one project's for an application that runs on one set of LPARs using one set of services, and maybe another's on different LPARs using a different set of services. I can easily just switch what project I'm working on and then start running commands for that project. I don't have to do anything like change my default profiles because they're all sourced right within the project. So I find that as a very handy feature personally. But again, it's more of an advanced features, as this capability for local configuration is not even possible in V1 LTS. So there's not really a transition to it. In V1 LTS, you just have everything globally on your PC, which by that I mean, if you run a command and it doesn't matter what directory you're in, that's always just going to use those global profiles that are in your Zowe home folder. And for more information on this, there are blogs on medium.com/Zowe. One is this Zowe CLI Getting Started Made Easy, which covers a lot of the details of team configuration. Now, an additional benefit is that we've automated team configuration setup for those who are leveraging the full Zowe solution. By full Zowe solution, I mean you have a Zowe API mediation layer installed and configured, it's set up, and it has services registered to it. Then in that case, the user experiences, it can be the same. They just import the shared config and start running. But the administrator's workload is heavily reduced. So the administrator just runs Zowe config auto init, provides the connection details for the Zowe API mediation layer, and this automatically generates that Zowe config JSON and Zowe schema JSON, but that Zowe config JSON is now pre-filled out with all the connection details for all the services that have a Zowe conformant API and that also have a conformant CLI plugin that is installed in their environment. The admin then edits the config for their environment, and this may be nothing. If they're just leveraging services directly and they don't leveraging services through the API mediation layer, and they don't want to add any non-connection information to that configuration, they're just done. But if they have other connections that are for services that aren't going through the API mediation layer, or they need to add maybe non-connection specific information, they could do that before hosting that configuration in a shared location to share with the rest of their users within their organization. And again, there's another blog on this feature written by Fernando titled Automatic Zowe CLI Service Configuration Using the API Mediation Layer. It covers a little bit more details on this new feature. The third key feature is daemon mode. And the goal of daemon mode is to improve the performance of Zowe CLI. And it does this by not requiring separate node processes to be spawned for every command. So in some environments, spawning these node processes takes a significant amount of time. An easy way to tell if a particular environment is hit by this issue is to just run a local help command, and that takes more than a second or two to run. Then the daemon mode will greatly benefit those environments. It makes those local commands nearly instantaneous. And to set this up, you just run after you install the core CLI, you'll just be able to run Zowe daemon enable and start running commands. In the current validation version that's on zowe.org today, I just wanted to note it doesn't yet have the Zowe daemon enable command. That is in development. There's a pull request open. It's just about to merge, and it will be in the next validation preview. If you follow this blog written by Dan Koloski, Zowe CLI A Faster Experience, you'll see the documentation today telling you how to set this up, but that will all be simplified by running a single command to enable this, and should greatly improve response times. Go ahead.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I haven't read the paper, sorry, but but does this also cache things like the profiles themselves, like the team configurations, or will they still be loaded every time you execute a command from disk?
Timothy, would you mind jumping in there with the details?
Sure. So daemon mode will reload team configuration, particularly since team config does allow you to have a project specific config, which may be different in different directories, and you may want to run Zowe CLI commands from different directories, even when you're using daemon mode. For that reason, we do always have it reloading the config, but the sorts of things that it will cache and not a reload are the CLI commands themselves, which would include CLI commands registered by plugins. Since loading all of the command handlers from disk is one of the that's one of the most intensive things that slows down Zowe CLI startup. So it is mainly just the commands that are cached, and then the actual plugins as well, but the team config would be reloaded for every command.
I see all that dynamically loaded JavaScript code as the command handlers, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Mm.
So there won't be any more JavaScript code loaded. That is all cached in the memory.
Oh, very nice. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the question. The next feature is secure by default. And this is essentially, if folks are familiar with the secure credential store plugin that's available for Zowe V1 LTS, that feature is now part of the core CLI itself. So there will not be a V2 of the secure credential store plugin. It's just baked in as a core feature. And whether or not the secure credential store is in use is generally determined by whether or not you are storing a property in the secure array in your config.json. It's another feature of V2 is that you can choose to store additional fields as secure. It's not limited to username and password. One question I think Peter you had asked in the introductory session, and I don't think we had a chance to touch base on this, was whether or not you could still override what secure credential manager was in use. That code is still in the product, but one thing I'll note is we used to have a Zowe config group in V1 that could be used to manage that sort of information. That is no longer available. That config group has been repurposed to manage the new style config. What would need to change if there was an existing credential manager implementation out there is it would need to have a means to write to that. There's a settings.json file in the Zowe home directory that determines what credential manager is in use. So if there was a plugin that needed to change that value, I believe it would override it there. But the hooks and things that are in the core code, those are still available.
Also, would it be possible then to override the credentials manager for all plugins and the core plugin CLI as well? For example, if I have an alternative implementation that doesn't use Keytar.
So I believe that's still available if you're using V1. Timothy, you may be able, or someone else on the call may be able to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure if V2 profiles, if the team config profiles respect the value in that settings.json or default to the built-in secure credential store manager. Like I'm not, just, do you know if we look at that settings.json when we're using V2 config?
Yes, I believe that team config will still support alternate credential managers if they're defined in that settings.json file. That's not a situation that like I don't think we have necessarily tested that extremely thoroughly, like since that's not like a use case that we anticipate a lot. So I'm not extremely confident, but I am fairly certain that that like the override will apply not only to V1 profiles, but also to V2 config and the way that that stores secure properties. So you could change the behavior where team config is storing the secure properties with Keytar, and you could override it with something else. I'm pretty sure that is something that we support.
I suspect that the core runtime operation would work. What's missing because of the repurposing of the old config group is that you'd probably have to hand edit that settings file to put the right value in there for that override credential manager. But once in there, I think maybe at runtime it will work correctly. We've kind of downplayed the ability to configure that just because of other priorities. If that became an issue, we'd have to find a way to make that a little more of a pleasant experience for a user to say, I want to set a new configuration, a new credential manager in the configuration.
Or perhaps as part of the init command, or not every user will run that, right? And the settings file is in the user home directory, correct?
That's correct.
Yes.
The use case I have in mind is the clip Shay, because Keytar doesn't run there. And the way like the Shay people and Thea people solved this, right? So for VS Code extension, this VS Code uses Keytar. They basically implemented an alternative Keytar interface to store things in Kubernetes secure storage as an alternative. So that plug we could also provide for CLI, thing will be extremely valuable for Eclipse users.
Yeah, not to put you on the spot here. So maybe if we need to kick it into a different call, we could. But is this something that you would consider building into the core product instead
Yep,
of a plugin?
yep, that's something I like to consider. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good.
Something we could collaborate on. Yeah. So I can't commit now to specific resources, but I definitely would be very interested in collaborating on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, because one thing we were liking to do in the long run is instead of having that settings we have to keep around more or less for compatibility reasons, but in the long term have it so you could specify what secure credential manager you wanted to use right in your Zowe config JSON, so that an administrator could determine, yeah, you're using this default secure credential store, you're using this other one to manage secrets in Kubernetes, or maybe a third one for something else, and then be able to specify that right within in that config.json they're rolling out. Kind of where we'd like to, direction we'd like to go in.
Yeah, in the team config file, that sounds good, because that's the admin defining it, and the admin would know about those differences.
Yep. Sounds good.
I have two more questions about secure credentials, but I can also wait for the end if you rather want to go through your slides first. But
Oh no, ask away. Go ahead.
So the migration process we were discussing, how that will work, as the format, as I understand, of the old secure credentials is different, right? So on macOS particular with the 1.0, there was always this problem, as every attribute was stored individually. It would prompt you for the password on the Mac for each property, right? So like if a plugin has 2 secure properties, then you have 5 profiles, and would ask you 10 times for your password. And I understand now you fix that by storing this all together in the blob. But is there a migration supported for users from the old format to the new format, or do they have to re-enter all their credentials?
No, there is a migration utility. It's going to just map everything sort of at like as is, I'll say, because like you have it'll take care of the reformatting of the secure credentials. But like, for example, today, one issue we see a lot is folks have 5 different profiles. They're all for, services on the same LPAR. So they all have the same username and password. When they do the migration utility, it'll put them in that way, five services with 5 sets of username and password. One thing you can do then is, and in the new config, you can consolidate that to show that they have a shared username and password, so you're not managing as many credentials. But the answer to your question is the migration utility. If you're working today on V1 LTS, you run Zowe config convert profiles, I believe is the command. It will handle that conversion for you. It also handles the removal of the secure credential store plugin because you no longer need it. It puts all the old profile information in basically a temp folder that you can revert to if you find that you're having trouble with the migration utility. And there's also a command you can run once the migration utility works for you, and you find everything's working as you would like. You can append a -- delete flag, and this will handle the cleanup of all your old information entirely, and it'll delete the old values out of your secure credential store, so that you just have the one blob as you're mentioning.
Oh, that's very nice. So, but you create basically an individual team config for your previous setup, right? Is it a team properties file, a team config file, or user config file that this migration produces?
When you run the migration utility, it will create it in the global folder, because the old profiles were only global. There was no team config. So it would put it all in your global location. However, if you decided, I want to transition to team, what you could do is you could then go to that global location, your Zowe CLI home directory, take the Zowe config JSON file and drop it into some other folder. And then you could just run like Zowe config secure, and then it would prompt you for all the secure properties, and then you would be set for your team config.
Well, so you could share your personal migrated file with the others then by putting it perhaps in the source code folder, and then everybody would use the same profiles with the same names that came out of migration, and just everybody else would have to enter their passwords again.
Exactly.
Oh, that sounds good. And then as a follow-up question to that, did I understand it correctly that the new code can also still work with the old profiles without migrating them? Or is the migration required?
It's not, it's not required. So the old V1, the profiles you created with V1 LTS will continue to work in V2 as long as you don't create a team config. But once you opt into creating this Zowe config JSON, then that's all that's used. So if the new team config's in use, you can't use the old profiles. But if you want to stick with the old profiles and make use of some of these other features like Daemon mode, you can do that and just not adopt the new team config yet.
And that includes secure credentials. Does it read the old secure credentials format as well then still?
Yes, it will. It'll respect that, because if you transition over, you will have that secure credentials store property set in your settings.json, and we'll continue to respect that. You'll just use the built-in implementation of secure credentials store, but that would be pretty much transparent to the end user.
And they don't have to install, and they don't have to install the old plugin, right? So the new stuff can read the old format and the new format.
That's right.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
And it's a one or the other choice. I'm only using one or the other, but it's not a one-way street. If it finds team configuration anywhere on your system, that's what it'll use. But if you just rename team configuration to another file name and it can't find it anymore, it will fall back and start using your old profiles if you leave your old profiles around. So that's how you control it as an end user. I either have a team config or I don't. And you control, I'm going to use the new team config approach, or I'm going to continue to use my old profiles. Gives you a way to experiment and then decide I got some real work to get done today and I don't have time to fool around anymore. Rename the file and use my profiles for some everyday work until I have more time to move forward with the new V2 functionality.
But if I do not specify this --delete parameter, will I have my password stored in two different locations in my secure credentials store then, for the old and the new format?
That sounds right. Can you confirm that, Timothy?
Yes, it'll still be stored in both places until you would run a delete flag, I believe. Like if you ran a migration utility a second time with the delete flag, that's when the old instance of the password would then get removed. But until then, if you ran a migration utility once without the delete flag, it would be stored in two places.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. I got all the right answers. Very good. I'm very happy.
Okay, sounds good. I'll move on to the breaking changes, and a lot of this is a recap of what we went through in the first session. So again, if there's any questions, just feel free to speak up and interrupt me along the way. The first is the Zowe CLI package, the @Zowe/CLI package should be removed as a plugin peer dependency in your plugins package.json. The next possibly breaking change, is the abstract REST client.m decode defaults to true. This would impact you if perhaps you implemented your own gzip decompression. That's now part of part of the core product. And it's also going to be, when we get to conformance criteria, it's going to be recommended that you use our implementation of gzip decompression and not just not override our implementation. Next is any command with --DCD. We looked through all the a lot of the conformant plugins that we were able to have access to, and I haven't seen this as a flag that anybody was using. If it is, please bring that to my attention. It was needed to have a hidden flag for daemon mode current directory for daemon mode to function. So if you are using that flag, reach out to us with that concern. We can have a discussion on it. But if you do that, that's not going to behave the way you may expect it to. It's going to be the global option for daemon mode current directory. Fourth is plugin management facility .require plugin module callback. The return values changed. We can go into a little bit more context, but just skipping to the bottom here, you can see it's to really simplify how this is called. So you can see the before case and probably what you have now when you're using this in your configuration loader.load. And now you can just pass in basically the plugin name. So you could essentially likely look through your code and see if you have this sort of format, and then you would just adjust to this format. Other CLI breaking changes, most of these are just simple name changes. For example, abstract REST client perform request. You would transition to abstract REST client .request. All the ones above Zowe SMF are more likely to have an impact. They may not even then, but they're more likely. These ones underneath are if you're leveraging functionality that's built into these core command groups, you may be impacted. That's why they're designated Zowe SMF workflows, USS, etc. Okay, now moving into V2 conformance, which is likely where your plugins may be more impacted than in those other breaking changes. One is if, I mentioned this earlier, if your plugin requires gzip decompression support, leverage the core CLI built-in support. Don't opt out of it and use your own. The other is plugins must have must not have a Zowe CLI peer dependency. This was mentioned before, I believe, even in the breaking changes. This is for improved NPM 7 compatibility plus, and the only peer dependencies you should have would be those which are imported in the plugin source code, which is likely just @Zowe/imperative. New installation requirements, you all, if you're V1 LTS conformant, your plugin's installable to V1 at Zowe/CLI at Zowe-V1-LTS, and your plugins, if they're on the marketplace, they're tagged as @Zowe V1 LTS. We're sticking with that trend, so you should have a @Zowe V2 LTS in the future. That's installable into @Zowe/CLI @Zowe V2 LTS. This eliminates the need for consumers to manage looking at a compatibility matrix, seeing what versions work with what. They can easily just grab the plugins at the release tag that matches the distribution of their CLI is the idea. Something a little bit new here is we used to not have any conformance criteria related to what the latest tag should be used for on NPM. Some folks used it for validation. Others used it to point to the most recent Zowe LTS. We're going with that route in the conformance criteria, that at latest should point to the same version as the most recent Zowe LTS tag. So today you would get the V1 LTS version, but once V2 is published, you would get the V2 LTS version. This is due to in the wild, we saw folks, leave off tags. And if folks are going to leave off tags, it defaults to at latest. And if we're going to take a default, we believe it should be the latest LTS release, not, possibly development versions or things like that. If you are trying to publish something in the public NPM and would like to have it validated, please use your own custom tag or use @next, which is what we use for Zowe for folks to validate technical previews and things like that. But if you have like some new feature that you want separately validated, you could just add in the feature name or whatever you want. There's freedom there. But again, latest should map to the most recent LTS release. Some new naming requirements. I don't expect anybody will be impacted by these. If you did have these names, you'd probably notice they weren't working as you had expected, but just to formally call it out, the following option names, aliases are reserved. --DCD is the new one for daemon mode. The other ones were existing, response format JSON, shorthand RFJ, help, the shorthand H, help examples, help web, and the shorthand HW. Some new profile requirements, and some plugins, already meet these conformance standards, but there are a few that need to make changes. The first is if your plugin uses a Zowe API mediation layer integrated API, it must have an option named base path in the profile to house the path of the associated service in the API mediation layer. We want to standardize on base path. This is important for a couple of reasons. One, base path is going to be automatically filled out if they're using the automatic team config. Two, I want to use base path for consistency so that all plugins are using the same terminology. And third, this needs to be a text input field. I think there's a couple out there or one out there that might be a Boolean based field. These base paths, they're configurable by site. So you don't want to have a Boolean to like a hard coded value because they are able to be configured by an administrator. If you have something hard coded in there and then they change it on the API ML side, you would be in a predicament there. So that's one new one. Next, if the plugin connects to a service, it must include the following properties, and they must be these exact properties: host, port, username, and password. This is important for two reasons. One, obviously consistency. Two is that you can now share fields amongst different profiles. So you can group things in ways that make it easier for you to manage the configuration at your site. So, for example, if 3 services share the same host name, they're running on the same LPAR, you can group them underneath, LPAR1, and you can put the host property and they'd be shared amongst those 3 services. If one uses host, one uses host name, and one uses something else, you'd have to list all 3 of those, and it'd get complicated. So that's why we're more strict on the names of these properties. If the plugin connects to a service and the service supports logging in with a token, it must include the following profile properties. Again, these exact names: token type, token value. If it supports logging in with PEM certificates, should use cert file, cert key file. If it supports logging in with PFX, P12 certificates, should use cert file passphrase. If the plugin provides an option to reject untrusted certificates, the property should be named reject unauthorized. Also, just a note here, we'll cover this in the naming section. Property names in the config or camel case CLI option names are cased lowercase with a dash separating them. Plugin supports team profile config. If you follow all of the other requirements for conformance, this will become seamless. You will get team profile config likely for free. I would recommend testing that out, but we haven't had any troubles if you meet all these other conformance criteria with the seamless transition. Plugin supports base profiles. I believe if your plugin doesn't support base profiles today, this is what enabled single sign-on for CLI plugins through the API mediation layer, because it's where your token type and token value are generally stored. Folks also use this to do what's achieved with nested profiles in the new team config, but they were able to share, like, it's the fallback profile. So for example, today in V1 LTS, some folks will store username and password or even host if they're only using a single LPAR in base profile. and then not specify it in the service profile, because it's just another layer to that order of precedence. It'll fall back to base profile. It's not in your service profile. If you don't yet support that, I believe Gene has a blog out there. This has been available for some time, so you might have to look at underneath his specific account on medium.com, but it provides instructions for how to complete that transition if you haven't already. The last here is to take advantage of the new Zowe config auto init command, a plugin that works with a single sign-on API ML compliant REST service must supply a new object in its plugin definition to identify that REST service. The new imperative API ML con lookup object must be in the plugin's definition. That object, this is the key reason here. That object includes the API ID and gateway URL of the corresponding REST service. And then that related REST service on the API ML side needs to also supply its API ID and gateway URL in the API ML section of its application YAML definition. And this is so that they can recognize each other. And the CLI knows that, okay, we can get the base paths for these services and automatically set up the config.json. So that's really the magic behind the scenes, is these two things know about each other and then can recognize that and automatically set up your the client's configuration. If you are using Zowe SMF service in your plugin, you don't need to necessarily handle that because the CLI will handle it automatically for the Zowe SMF service. So if you're leveraging Zowe SMF as an additional service, or maybe as your only service, that should just be handled for you.
I have a quick question. On the last slide there, you stated it out with the reject unauthorized, where, the camel case for the profile itself and the dash with the CLI option. Is that the same with base path? Because how it is now, it's the camel case in the profile. If, the plugin service has its own base path.
Yeah, this was an option on the CLI was base dash path. So in the config, it would be base and capital path.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Moving on to additional conformance criteria, infrastructure best practices. So in their imperative config file, plugins should make their imports as few as specific as possible. Okay, one note here I want to call out. We're transitioning to best practices, so these aren't as strictly required as the ones I had previously talked about. This best practice will decrease your load time and make your CLI plugin more responsive. HTTP or HTTPS requests to REST APIs should use the imperative REST client instead of implementing your own. You'll get advantages here. One, all the other plugins are leveraging this REST client. So if there are any issues, we'll resolve those and everybody will benefit. The other one is, again, if there's some sort of vulnerability discovered, it will be addressed, just in the one location versus everybody needing to adjust, if you're using one of these other packages, if there's a vulnerability in those, you're somewhat on your own on addressing those for your plugin. So if you standardize on this, I think it'll benefit your plugin development in the long run from those perspectives. New naming best practices. Names of CLI commands, groups, options must be kebab case, lowercase, and hyphens. As I mentioned earlier, names of properties in Zowe config JSON should be camel case. Recommend only using alphanumeric characters. Some folks use things like pound symbols and different things we discovered in V1 LTS. And some of those special symbols mean things on different terminals. So might not have a desirable experience if running in like PowerShell or something like that if you only had tested on command prompt. So this is just something to be aware of. We recommend only use alphanumeric characters. New profile best practices. The plugin specifies options to be pre-filled by default in Zowe config JSON once Zowe config init has executed. So an example of this is when you run Zowe config init, what we see is it initially generates a flat structure. We felt that that was easiest to get started with. And you have, for example, a Zowe SMF type profile. And underneath that, it has port pre-filled in with 443, which is the default port. And for example, if a user is just interacting with Zowe SMF and they're on port, 1443 or something else, they can just go into this config and change the value of that field. If you have fields for your plugins that you expect most administrators to have to edit, we recommend taking advantage of this feature, this ability to pre-fill in those options so that when they go into the config, they just have to edit a value rather than having to add a property and a value. They will get IntelliSense to add the property, but it's just easier if the property is already filled out if you expect most folks to edit it. And really, if you already have a default value, there's not too much harm in putting it in there anyway. Might make it easier for folks to edit and get started with your plugin configuration. And lastly, and a lot of folks have already contributed this, so thank you, is that plugin command help is contributed to this repo, Zowe/Zowe CLI web help generator, for the purpose of hosting ecosystem web help on Zowe Docs. So today on Zowe Docs, if you go to the online web help, which is very easy to point customers to, they would just see the help for Zowe contributed plugins and Zowe CLI. So there's like the Kix DB2, FTP plugin, etc., MQ, others. We're opening that up to also show Zowe CLI conformant plugin web help. If you would like to be included in that, again, a lot of folks have already contributed that. You just contribute to this repo, and the first time we're going to host this is in the next update, actually, of V1 LTS, and we'll continue to host this for V2 going forward. So I encourage you all to contribute there. Some resources to get started, just really a single link for everything you need to know about the next release of Zowe, zowe.org/vnext. This really contains all the key information, and I'll go there in a second. One other place I wanted you to be aware of is, again, medium.com/Zowe. There's lots of blogs detailing a lot of these features. There's also a recent blog published by Timothy on migrating Zowe CLI plugins for V2 conformance that covers a lot of the key migration aspects that will impact most plugins. And it doesn't necessarily cover everything, so I encourage you to review the whole list. But for a lot of what you need to do to migrate, it should be in this blog. And just before we go to questions here, let me pull up that vnext site. So again, you can stay in tune with the latest announcement on zowe.org/vnext. General information. This includes a lot of what I covered today, including all these breaking changes. You can also have a nice view of the conformance criteria updates. You can just click into this box Excel spreadsheet. And you'll see here, if you scroll through this, all the things in green are what's new for V2. And you can easily see it. Again, we covered all this in the presentation, but you can go through this list one by one and put checks next to things you've verified and accomplished, and go through it that way. And then finally, after the conclusion of today's office hours, sometime in the near future, we'll be adding the recording of this meeting here, as well as the presentation will be added here, and you can check that out for reference. So with that, I think I'll just open it up if there are any more questions.
Hey, Mike, it's Rose. One thing came to mind as you were talking. You had made reference to a prior blog that Jean had written. Was that to support the transition to, was it base profiles?
Yeah, that's correct. Yep.
Okay. All right. I'll see if I can find a link to that and maybe make that available.
Some of the names blur. It might have been included as part of token handling blog. That's another thing you might look at, see if that's the material Mike was referencing.
Okay. Maybe we can update the presentation with those few links.
Okay.
Or perhaps put them directly onto the next page or the relevant publications. already.
Yes, there you go. Even better.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll do that following this call.
All right. Thank you.